So Houston Brown is our first speaker. This is more of an education topic around moving IP knowledge in-house. So I actually met Houston at an IP event in Winnipeg several months ago, and I really liked his approach and what he had to say on IP, so I invited him to Vancouver. So I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you. Sound check. Yep. I like it. Okay. Great. Got a timer. First session, like bring the energy, pressure's on. I'm feeling good. Let's do it. I also tend to move around when I'm chatting, and that could cause a problem with the speaker, so apologies in advance for buzzing you. We're gonna do moving IP knowledge in-house. Peter asked me to speak to this topic, and the first question to address, of course, is why? Right? Like, hands up here if you're a startup founder or involved in a startup. This is the key question always to ask, right? Like, your time is your most valuable resource. Should you do anything that is not on the critical path? Probably not. So should we bring IP management in-house? There has to be a compelling reason. I'm going to try and pitch that compelling reason today, and we'll find out whether or not you buy it. The answer to this question might just be yes, because my investor said they're not going to scratch a check unless I have some level of IP due diligence done. But I'm going to try and sell you on something a little bit broader and kick off by shouting out Jeff Bezos, because that's what we all do in these type of circles. He said, focus on what makes your beer taste better, right? That was 2008 when he was addressing the Y Combinator startup school. And he was making an analogy to back in the day when beer was just coming on the scene and beer makers were thinking about developing their own electricity to power their distilleries or whatever it is that you make beer in, right? And his point was that electricity doesn't make your beer taste better. Something in the beer does, right? And if we flash forward and put this in the modern context, and you're asking yourself what makes our beer taste better, there's something there that isn't the real estate that you rented or, you know, the John Deere tractor that you have running in the back. There's something there that is intangible that is worth investing in. And when we're talking about intangible assets, we're getting into the realm of IP. So let's go there now. On the right side here, tangible assets, just to like level set on some basic terminology here. We're looking at things like real estate and inventory and cash and equipment. These are things that you can touch. And the other side of the dichotomy here is intangible assets. That amazing software code that you write, or maybe the patent that you got, or some special contract that allows you to work with some special strategic partner. These are your intangible assets, the things that you can't touch. And if you're a startup and you're looking at your exit, you're maybe thinking, what does it look like? How does this break down? Say we shoot the moon and go public. What percentage of the value of our company comes from the intangible side versus the tangible? And the graph in the center helps put that in context for you, right? The S&P 500, the monster companies between 1975 and 2020, the amount of value that comes from the intangible side is just growing and is essentially the whole pie now. So your focus as a startup is on something intangible. And you're not there yet, right? You're a startup. So what does it mean if you're not taking that approach? Maybe you're going to get acquired along the way, and that's what you're thinking about. In this case, let's go to the seminal textbook on valuing mergers and acquisitions, and they say this: the driving force behind the majority of present mergers and acquisitions, and those completed during the past decade, has been the acquirer's desire to obtain the target's intangible assets. So again, it's clear the focus is on these things that you can't touch and how you protect them. To put this in another context, you might say that you as a company are creating some intangible asset driven value multiplier. That's what your company is for. You put venture capital in one side and you put 10x returns out on the other side to go to an acquisition or to IPO or whatever it is that you're shooting for. And so to simplify the equation, we can say intangible assets are essentially 100% of the pie for startups. If you get this focused and you get this right, you win the game. And if you get it wrong, you probably don't. Okay, so that's what intangible assets mean for the startup. What is it? How does IP fit into that, right? Intangible assets as a category, again, just level setting on some terminology here. We can say there's two types of these intangible assets. We can say this is either tacit knowledge, those things that are floating around in our head that we haven't totally committed to paper, that we haven't got dialed, versus those that we have codified. We've written them down, we've turned it into, an AutoCAD, or we have some other way that we can reproduce it, make it better, share it. Those are the things that we can start to focus IP around. IP is your lever for capturing any intangible assets that have been codified. So you're already churning out intangible assets in your startup from day one. And the question really becomes, are you going to capture that value or not? I'm just trying to advance the slide here, but it's not going for me. Bear with me. All right, I promised I would do that. Okay, here's the examples. Everything from concepts and ideas and inventions, everything else on the screen there, data, algorithms, operating manuals, procedures, branding, etc. These are the types of things that fall into IP, and these are the kind of things that we might think about protecting. So that's kind of the why, is how this fits, and that's also the base terminology that we need to kick off today's talk. Let me just say who I am so that you can say, I buy this or I don't. That's me in the middle. I'm Dr. Houston Brown, principal and founder of In-House IP, patented inventor, registered patent agent, 10 years of IP experience, a bunch of it in-house, including being the VP intellectual property for a top 100 global clean tech company. And then I put just kind of IP plus here because I do a bunch of stuff around governance and licensing and valuation and sale and acquisition. So there's kind of para IP that is where I spend a decent amount of my time. Okay, and this is the table of contents for our talk. And it's also probably the most valuable slide in the talk because this is your map for when you're getting into the weeds on IP and you're like, I don't know where I am. This is your touch point where you can say, okay, I get this. There's just one pyramid. There's only 3 rows. Anyone can stick to that. Where am I? Which bucket am I in? So let's take a little time to go through it together. At the top, IP strategy. At the top, because anything that you do around IP should be responsive to some broader strategic objective that you have for IP. We're going to touch just a little bit on IP strategy today, but the headline on this one is it shouldn't just be a one-off, we're just going to do this. It should be, we're going to do this because the strategy says that, and this aligns with that strategy. At level two buckets, IP value, like creation and extraction. These are your patents and your trade secrets, etc. And on the other side, IP risk, so other people's patents, etc. Identifying those risks and mitigating those risks. And here's the gift that we are all happy to receive. Value creation and risk mitigation can be kind of separated. You can think of these two things individually, which vastly simplifies your decision making. So we'll get into some of the details in a second, but at any given time, again, think that you can come back to a slide like this and say, okay, is this about creating value in my company or is this about reducing risk for my company? And boy, am I lucky that I only have to think about those individually and not get them wrapped up together and make some decisions based on kind of an unclear framework. Very clear, separate distinctions. At the bottom, you have the foundational things like who is involved in your decision-making, what processes are they running internally to make them integrate with the rest of your company, and what resources or budget are you going to put towards IP. So this is our table of contents. This is our framework for any IP decision making, and we're going to touch on each corner of this pyramid now. We'll start with IP strategy. The first thing to highlight is that plans and strategies are not the same thing, right? A plan is a list of things that you're going to do. A strategy is an integrative set of choices that define where you're going to play and how you're going to win. Like, planning feels so good, right? You know the outcome already. You can just say, here are the 10 things I'm going to do. They're going to take this long. They're going to cost this much. There's a comfort in planning. Strategizing is the opposite. It is fraught, right? You know it if you've been doing it because you're making hypotheses about the market and what's going to add value, and you don't know how they're going to turn out. It's your best educated guess, but it's still a guess. And so we are not talking about IP planning today because IP planning is routine. We are going to talk about IP strategy, particularly if we have a chance, maybe in a later lecture, to go deeper dive on IP strategy. We want to go into that level where it starts to become this integrative set of choices. And if you find your planning, you probably need to push yourself to get outside of your comfort zone, because an IP plan isn't going to drive value in your company long term. A strategy will. Okay, let's talk just this one little bit deeper about IP strategy then. So the take-home message on IP strategy is right at the top here, that it is responsive to your commercialization strategy, or you might say your business strategy or your growth strategy, depending on your terminology, but the general idea is the same, and it's that IP is the tail that shouldn't wag your startup's dog, right? Like, you have a commercialization plan that you need to execute. You don't want to do IP for the sake of IP. You want to do IP to bring forward that broader plan that you're after. And so at any time when you're thinking about your IP strategy, the first question is, how does it serve the broader mission? The next point is to bring it back down that level of the framework that we were looking at and say, okay, we said, a strategy is this integrated set of choices about how we're going to play, or where we're going to play and how we're going to win. The IP strategy side of that is essentially taking the two pieces, value creation and risk mitigation, and superimposing them onto that broader question. You want to have a nested IP strategy that's responsive to the one at the top that says, all right, how are we going to contemplate the IP risks that surround this commercialization strategy? And then how are we going to align the intangible assets that we're developing with this commercialization strategy? So that's like way too brief. We could go so deep on IP strategy and it would be really fun, but we only have a short time for this talk and we have to hit these other points. So let's go to IP risk mitigation. And for time, let's just go right to the point that's probably most incisive here. There's lots of risk going on, but you're probably at the end of the day most interested in patent risk for your startup, right? And this is plain language and, to be honest, oversimplified, but the most concise representation of what I think patent risk looks like for a startup. So I'm just going to take you here with it a couple of lines. The first one says, just like your patents enable you to stop others from doing what you've claimed, others can do the same to you. So we're worried about other people's patents when we're thinking about patent risk here. And obtaining a granted patent only means you have a right to exclude others from practicing within your claims. It does not entitle you to practice what is within your claims yourself. That is the number one misconception that every startup has coming in the door. They say, we've got a patent, we're allowed to do that. And I say, you've got a patent, that is irrelevant. There's a distinction here, right? The question is, how does your activity compare to the patents held by your competitors? Your patent does not impact that directly. So whether or not you decide to patent, patent rights held by third parties represent a potential risk to your company's freedom to operate. And ignorance is not a defense. So we can't say we didn't know, we should be fine, it won't hold up. And this term freedom to operate is a helpful one to remember because you're going to hear it tossed around a lot. And this is what they're referring to. It's does our commercialization path have any legal challenges underlying it that we either know about or not? So high level IP risk, if we narrow it down and focus specifically on patent risk, this is the kind of question that we need to be looking at. If you identify some of these risks as you're doing some strategy work or as you're working with your investors and trying to satisfy them that you have a clear path, and you come across some third-party patent on your tech development roadmap, there are best practices and reasonable ways to de-risk this. This is like an in-house practice is, okay, the landscape is the landscape, how do we navigate it? We don't have time today to go into the details of what each of these looks like, but in any given category here, you can look at a well-trodden path to take the risk off the table in some way. And that is largely the kind of work that is done in-house by your team. Okay, that was just touching really quick on IP risks. Let's go to value creation next. And across the top here, we have the 5 general categories of IP assets, right? We have trade secrets, we have patents, industrial designs, trademarks, copyrights. There are others. These are probably the ones that you're most interested in though. And again, to simplify, we're just going to look at the trade secret and patent piece today. And again, only scratch the surface. What I want to highlight for you here as we focus on patents and trade secrets is how they are almost yin and yang to each other. The strengths of a patent and the strengths of a trade secret are reciprocal, and the weaknesses are too. So bundling them together is a helpful play, and figuring out how to do that in a kind of coherent way is something that is hard to outsource to external counsel. So the basics of trade secrets are on the slide now. Trade secrets protect valuable confidential information. And in general, to qualify as a trade secret, the information must have 3 criteria. 1, it has to have some commercial value. 2, it must be known only to a limited group of persons. And 3, it must be subject to reasonable steps taken by the rightful holder of that information to keep it secret. The level of capital investment required to capture something as a trade secret is almost 0. The level of human investment to capture something as a trade secret is almost 0. You don't have to engage an IP office to capture something as a trade secret. And the term length for them is indefinite, or until the secrecy is lost. Apologies for the Mac PC transition there, messing with a little bit of the formatting, but I think the idea still holds, right? So trade secrets, cheap, fast, no IP office involved. Patents, on the other side, patents protect technical solutions to science and engineering problems, and occasionally, if you're creative, to some business problems. The major downside of patents here is that they require the detailed disclosure of technical information, and then they're published for public consumption. This is like the exact opposite of a trade secret, right? All those hard-won things that you have behind your closed doors, if you want that monopoly position associated with your patent claims, the quid pro quo is telling the whole world all that secret sauce. And bundling these things together so you have some things patented and some things trade secret. Again, this is such a determination that only someone that is within your company can really help strike a balance in the nuances there. So again, note the contrast with trade secrets. The level of economic and capital investments for patents, the highest among all of these classes. We're going to go into the details in a second. The level of human capital investment, also super high. It's just so much work to get a patent filed, let alone prosecuted, let alone granted. I can see the nodding heads, so I know you know what I'm talking about here. Level of engagement with the IP offices, very high, and then term length, 20 years. So are you starting to see how these two things are almost exactly opposite of each other, and how you might take some benefits from one and some from the other, mix it in your IP strategy, and try and build some sum that's greater than its parts? Okay, so value, we're on the value side here. We've talked about the asset classes in general. Probably you're most interested in patenting, so I'm just going to tell you what is clear to me after doing this for an awfully long time in-house. And it starts with calling out 3 problems. Here's the first one. Patents are eye-wateringly expensive. Like $50K, north of $50K for the cost of a single patent in the US over the course of its life cycle, broken down around the wheel. And that's not contemplating the one that you filed in Canada or in China or in Japan. And to be fair, it's not a straight cost multiplier. You don't just say, and then times it by 5 because there's 5 countries, because there are some efficiencies at scale. But nonetheless, 1 is expensive and 2 is more expensive than that, and 5 is more expensive than that. And that's only one family, and there's probably a collection of families. So this situation starts off and requires some care just due to the costs alone. Problem number 2, quote, 90% of patents are worthless. Now that's a contrarian take. That's not my take. But I think it's worth voicing because you might not hear it very often. And I like to consider softening it to something like 90% of patents can't be linked directly to quantifiable value. And that's a problem, right? You should be able to justify every dollar spent in your budget. Let's get a little bit more rigorous here. What does it look like to be savvy in-house and be able to draw some of these lines? So here's the key graph on the side, and the green line is what everyone assumes, that patent value as a function of the number of filings, that there's going to be some normal distribution, right? Like all patents are worth something. Some of them are worth more than others. Some guys are 6 feet tall, some are 6'2", some are 5'8". That's not the distribution when the academic patent lawyers go through and set the curves. They actually follow the blue line, the power curves. Put another way, some small fraction of patents are extremely valuable to the companies that own them. And then there's this enormous, what's that called? The tail, the long tail, that is, yeah, exactly. That represents the mass majority of patent filings ending on this low thing. So it begs the obvious question of how do you end up at the upper side of this power law curve? And the answer to that I've got in some slides that come, I think, but it's just one person's opinion. But it's the reason why I left a law firm at the end of the day, because I felt like the levers that you pulled to end up on the high side of that curve come from in-house. They don't come from external counsel. External counsel is amazing, but they can't do magic, right? You need to give them everything that you have internally to set them up for success. So let's talk about what that might look like. But first, let's hit the third problem. Investors know the difference, right? Investors are savvy about IP, or they're hiring someone who is. And so the solution here, I think, the reason that I think Peter asked me to give this talk is to say, how do you position an internal team member to provide the relevant internal expertise to throw you up on the high side of that curve? Or as I like to term it, to unlock investment grade patents, patents that an investor would look at, a savvy investor, and say, that's something that I can back. Okay, so I tried to write on one slide almost a haiku that will land you as close as possible to the high end of that curve, or at least to give you the statistically most likely chance of landing on the high side of that curve. And this is my 3-liner. To get that, you need a valid claim that draws a detection line across a commercially valuable choke point. And I'm going to take you through each of those pieces now to help you understand what that jargon actually means. First one, a valid claim. So as you know, your patent's claims define the scope of your legal protection. They are the thing that matters when you go to court. They are the numbered list at the end of the patent document. So there's probably like 2 pages of claims back there, and the whole thing's like 90 pages. Almost all of the value provided there is in that list of numbered claims at the back. That's where you want to focus your time and your energy and your attention. And patent claiming is an exercise in restriction. That is to say, every word that I add to a patent claim reduces its scope. So when I go up to write my first patent claim for my first client and I just write a machine, it's like the broadest claim ever. It could be any machine. It could even be a boat. It could be unbelievable too. But it's not going to be valid until we meet a couple of bars that clear the prior art. And that's what we're going to talk about here quickly. So a valid claim is both novel and inventive. It's a bunch of other stuff too, but this is the stuff that the in-house person really needs to get right in terms of setting external counsel up for success. So novel, it means that the claim has some combination of elements. When you look at the claim written on the page, it's going to be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things in a list, and then some set of words that tie those things together. And that claimed combination has to have never been disclosed before in a single instance of prior art. That's generally and oversimplified what the novelty requirement is for a patent claim. And importantly, just because you didn't know that someone else already disclosed that doesn't make your invention novel. So again, ignorance doesn't play into this. The question is whether or not a third party would be able to determine if this was novel or not. So when we're looking at a valid claim, novelty is our first bar, inventive step is our second one. Again, oversimplified, but if you're thinking in-house, what does it mean to add value in this question? You're looking to answer or to find a claimed combination of elements and limitations that wouldn't be immediately obvious to a skilled practitioner that can combine multiple pieces of prior art. So this just got a bunch more complex, right? First, it's not just a single document or a single report or a single talk. It could be multiple. It could be, hey, we read this trade journal over here. Oh, and there was this other patent over here. And you can bring them together, right? And then there's also this idea of a skilled practitioner. Like, what does that mean? Do they have a PhD? Do they have like a bachelor's degree? How inventive are they? We can't go into those details right now, but they have clear answers. And I can just leave you with a general rule of thumb. Everyone in this room is probably going to overestimate the level of skill for that quote unquote skilled practitioner, right? Scientists and engineers are by definition inventive. It's what brings them into the field. They assume, they set that bar higher 9 times out of 10 when I work with clients. They assume that a skilled practitioner is operating at a higher level than the legal requirement associated with it. Okay, so we're talking about this. We're talking about capturing a patent claim in the most valuable way that you can, trying to end up on the high end of that curve. We described what a valid claim might be if you were to think about it in loose terms. And now we're going to go to the bottom line and talk about what it means to span a commercially valuable choke point. Again, I think you'll agree with me that this is mostly an in-house exercise. This is the kind of question that you could only answer if you have a nuanced understanding of the value drivers in your company. So by commercially valuable, we can almost go to like Mad Libs style question and answer period. Hey, do you remember those from back in the day? I used to do those when I was a kid. So you would just fill in the gaps and get some hilarious result from it. But in this case, we're getting a result that helps you better understand what the commercial value is of your invention. So here, the forecasting exercise, you should be able to get to the point for each patent that you file before you go and engage a lawyer and spend a bunch of money to say, you know, we predict that in some year, like 5 years from now, some part of the value chain that we care about will demand exactly this. Some means for extracting lithium, or some means for plugging in our electric vehicle, or some means for making the list goes on. And they're going to be willing to pay X million dollars per year for it. And million is an intentional choice there. When you do the value trade-offs, you should be able to justify that level of revenue generation associated with this to make it worthwhile to think about patenting here. So anytime that you're going through this patenting activity, this is the kind of forecasting exercise that you want to be able to put down on paper and feel relatively confident in the value that's going to come out of it. That's what we mean by commercially valuable. What do we mean by choke point? Well, it could be many things, right? It could be technological or regulatory, or some network thing, or a channel relationship, but there are many choke points in the landscape around your companies. They create these limitations that will make something impossible because of some reason. It'll be, you can't do this because there's a restriction on some airways. The only way that you're allowed to do this is by flying a drone through there. Hey, we own drone technology. That's a commercially valuable choke point. Something like that. Ours is the only way to something. And the nearest viable alternative fails to compare. You can't use this other alternative because this. Or if we use the other alternative, it's like 10 times worse, or at least 5 times worse. But if it's like 1 time worse, there's a hard conversation there, and it's probably not going to be worth the spend. Anyways, those are in-house type questions to consider. Okay, back to our almost haiku. We know it's a valid claim. We know it's going to span a commercially valuable choke point. Why did I waste 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words on drawing a detection line? Because it's super important that you be able to detect someone else's patent infringement, right? If you can't detect someone infringing your claim, you can't monetize it. You can't license it. You can't enforce it because you can't see it. So before, right up at the front, when you're doing this in-house exercise, you want to be thinking about what it means to be able to see your patent claim in action. So if it's a device or is it a system, would you be able to go and buy your competitor's product and take it apart and determine if it reads on your claim? Or maybe it's a composition of matter, like you're doing some nanotech stuff. Is there an analytical fingerprint that you could run scanning electron microscopy and be like, oh yeah, less than 10 nanometers, we got them? If it's not, it's probably better protected trade secret. There's a bunch of nuances that are going to come into making that determination, but at a high level, this is a major lever, right? This is going to swing it one way or the other. Can you see it? Because if you can't, you probably don't want to spend the money on it, but even 10 times more important than that, you don't want to tell everyone everything about it and then not be able to detect when they actually go ahead and do it and claim the monopoly position that you spent so much on and worked so hard to uncover. Okay. We're moving through our framework, quick time check. We're on to the bottom area. We're not going to go into too much detail on these because time is tight. We have on the bottom again, IP team, IP process, IP resources. On the IP team, I'll just say, without speaking to a side, the general approach that startups take is to take someone that is a skilled scientist or engineer and just plug them into a base level of IP training so that they can grow their IP savvy and your company's IP savvy as the company scales up. So you don't need probably myself, like a registered patent agent right from day one. And you have external counsel always that you can rely on, but can you invest a day a week or a day every 2 weeks of some skilled person that's really bought into the mission of your company, that probably has equity, right, and is going to be in it for the long haul? Can you help them scale up as, say, an IP manager internally to answer the types of questions that we've been doing here, to answer investor questions, and to build some of the processes and stuff that will allow this type of thing to work? On the IP resources side, I'm also not going to go into this, but these are budget considerations. And IP, in my opinion, should be held to the same standards as every other business unit in your company. So you should be able to say, we're spending X, the value we're going to get from it is Y, and the success metrics that we're defining are these 5 things. And IP resourcing should fall into that. In terms of securing those resources, this is exactly the type of meeting to be involved in, right? Because there's a ton of government funding available right now, and you can use that funding and you can use it strategically, particularly if you have someone in-house that's willing to call the shots on that and be held accountable internally for the success of that type of piece. So let's go to IP processes to finish this off. IP processes, but that's, I'm referring to the workflows that you have internally and the way that you keep your documents organized and the tools that you use and the checklists that you use and the spreadsheets, the decision trees, all of those type of things. And again, we don't have time to hit all of them, so I'm just going to give you an example like I've given you on some of the other corners of the pyramid and call out one that I get asked about all the time, which is there's been some prior disclosure and what are its implications on patenting, right? This is actually a process question at the end of the day in terms of answering it. So my phone rings and it's, hey, Houston, we told someone how we do this. Long, pregnant pause, and they're freaked out, right? Can we still patent it? And the answer is always maybe, which is just like such a professional answer, hey? Like any accountant or lawyer, whoever, the answer is like, oh, it depends. But actually, like it does depend, but what it depends on, all those things can lead you to a very clear answer if you properly document them and incorporate them into the decision-making process that you have there. So what it says here is, it depends on the fact pattern. If you capture the relevant details and take them into account in a rigorous patentability analysis, the answer should be very clear. So patentability analysis is something that your in-house IP manager would just do every time some new opportunity comes up to get an assessment of whether or not it's worth pursuing or not. And the way that you would execute something like this is to use what we call, at least at our little consulting firm, a disclosure impact tree, which is just like any other decision tree. Like, when did this happen? Okay. Was it under NDA? Did it actually enable the invention to the point that the person that you told would actually be able to practice the claim? Are you looking to file in a jurisdiction that has grace periods, et cetera? You can just work your way through a decision tree in view of your IP strategy, where you're going to file, why you're filing, what you're trying to protect, and make the decision on whether or not this disclosure is actually a challenge or not. And every piece there is variable, right? The scope of your claims hasn't been fixed yet. So it might be that you disclosed this, but you claim that. And it might be that the disclosure that you made was not actually wouldn't actually be deemed a public disclosure. So you get into the details and the nuances relatively quickly. The important thing is to just capture it and then take a systematic approach to going through it and team up with your external counsel to make sure that you get the details right. But it's about simplifying what feels like a relatively nebulous and high stakes conversation and just getting the black and white down at day one, and then going forward and making the business decisions around it based on sound processes. So that's the bottom of our pyramid. It's the one example from IP processes. We hit everything from IP strategy to value creation and risk, and then the basics of who's on the team, what processes are they using, and how they get the resources to do their thing. And this was our one example there. So I'll leave it there and be happy to take your questions. And thank you. Yeah.
So trade I love the distinction between trade secrets and the patent side. So for all the people who are in technology and are thinking about open source, how does that affect to the patent side? Because it would be kind of open source, but all the values in the trade secret.
Okay, that's a hard question to answer concisely because there are so many nuances and concerns associated with open source software. So to be honest, I'd like to just punt it and answer it one-on-one when we have some chance to get into it, because it gets extremely case specific. Your ability to patent something the bar becomes much higher in terms of using open source. The freedom to operate considerations get considerably more complex because open source software does have restrictions on the way that it can be used, and those are often overlooked or misunderstood. And then the ability to capture things as trade secret, if you're relying on underlying open source software, get equally complex because your trade secret stuff needs to be rising above the level of the open source software that sits below it. And those factors all come in that make it hard to give a decent answer that isn't case specific, but I love getting case specific. So let's chat about it when you have a chance.
Okay, a quick follow-up because I want to just inspire the people here. So the question is really for the audience. So the deeper part is, what if we don't use open source, but we publish open source code, our own companies?
Okay, that makes me so happy. One of the main approaches to de-risking your technology commercialization path to securing your freedom to operate can come from publicly disclosing what you're doing, releasing the monopoly position and not pursuing it in any way, even making it open source if you like, but so-called salting the earth, which is to say, putting it out there so that none of your other competitors that surround you can go ahead and patent it themselves and hold it against you. And so many companies in tech, even in oil and gas, will file a patent application with no intention of pursuing it to grant, because patent applications are so easy to find for a patent examiner that if someone else tried to go ahead and patent it, they would immediately find it. There are also other versions of that same play where you could make a public disclosure on like your grandma's blog that no one's going to find ever, but it is still a public disclosure. And if you needed to sink someone else's ship with it 15 years down the road, you can always keep that locked in your library for your company and say, oh, didn't you know that we disclosed that back in 2024? We didn't submit it as a patent, we didn't put it in SPE, but it was still a public disclosure. And then there are 10 other variations of the same play. So you're touching on a very elegant and relatively sophisticated approach to freedom to operate that a lot of companies aren't thinking about. So thanks for flagging it.
Thank you. Really appreciate the talk. As a startup, it's really hard to, look at all the elements, particularly freedom to operate, right? Any tips around how do we effectively look at freedom to operate?
Yes. Two categories of tips. The first one is to engage in, say, the development of an IP strategy through the existing channels now, because a lot of that work could be done for you quickly and with minimal headache to better understand your landscape. We're going to talk about landscapes later today, and getting an idea of what that landscape looks like just got a whole lot easier because there's funding available for it. More tactically, one, there are really elegant and totally free patent search tools out there that you can take advantage of. Happy to flip you a couple of links when the time comes after if you want to catch up. And two, patents are characterized in a way that makes them searchable, not based off of the keywords used in them, but in terms of the technologies that they cover. They're called IPCs, or patent classification codes. There's a couple of different types, but in short, you should be able to search patents based off of the underlying technologies that they cover, even if they use some sneaky words in the way that they were going about casting them. So with a couple of clicks on some SAS, you should be able to get a pretty clear idea of what you're looking at. Now, here's the giant caution. Searching patents on your own has embedded within it a significant amount of risk, because particularly in the US, but also in some other jurisdictions, the act of looking at patent documents and finding them can bring on extra liability, because you would then have known that a patent existed and did it anyways. And so the approach there is to say, we're either going to look at patent documents or we aren't. And I would argue so strongly in favor of looking at them, because I don't think you can navigate a landscape that you don't understand. But if you are going to look at them, you have to look at them in an intelligent way and with some guardrails in place, so that you're not just dabbling and taking on a bunch of risk with a little value add. And so setting up some basic systems, or just downloading them from a best practice of an in-house practitioner, will allow you to get as much of the value out of that as possible, as much freedom to operate assurance as possible, without loading on undue risk. So it is worth calling out that that caution and navigating around it. Another question. Oh,
Yeah, from the live stream, what are your thoughts on how AI will impact IP?
oh juicy.
In 30 seconds?
30 seconds. Okay, there's so many ways to interpret that question, because AI is impacting the practice of IP for a professional. It is also impacting the invention side, and whether or not IP can, or AI can, say, be the inventor of its own patent application. And then copyright, and say the case with the New York Times that is going to the Supreme Court in the US, and around what AI ownership around copyright looks like. In a 30-second answer, I can only point out those various ways that it is going, like, it's on, full on in each of those ways. It's going to change the way the profession operates. It's going to change the speed at which things happen. And the real challenge that I would flag is that courts and regulations and legislations happen so slowly, and AI happens so quickly, that the IP AI interface is already muddy, and it's only going to get muddier. And it doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities there. In fact, there's probably more opportunities, but it is something to spend more than just the 30 seconds that we have on it. Yeah, that last one.
Oh, last but not least. Great talk, Houston. I wish I'd heard this 6 years ago, before I got in a quagmire with patents in China. Simple question though, can you use third parties and therefore be discreet about doing the search? And if so, would that be confidential? Or, like if you used a lawyer, for example, would it be confidential?
Great question. Thank you. The short answer is third parties exist, and they are often, you can select ones that are law firms and those that are service providers and not law firms. And the particulars around the types of services they provide vary greatly. And so I guess there's two parts to your question. The first one just being, can you and should you? And the answer to your first question is yes, you can shield a lot of that risk by having a third party look at it and being really strategic in the way that then you engage the results that come back from them. For example, on the phone initially, and then having them only send over X, etc. So standard practice from an in-house professional is how you do that. There's a much broader question embedded in your second part, which is equally interesting, around how those communications would be interpreted in terms of privilege. And there are nuances around whether or not you have a lawyer doing it versus a patent agent. And again, we wouldn't have time to go into them, but there are benefits to seek out, and there are well-established best practices, pluses and minuses to each approach that you take, but at least the approaches are well documented and trodden paths to follow.
All right, we're going to wrap it
Okay, that was
there.
good.
Thank you very
Angie.
much, Houston. I'm like afraid to move. Houston, there is one question that everyone's going to ask me, so I'm asking you. Slides availability.
Oh, yeah, I can make the slides available.
Okay.
You already have them, and you have my consent to give
Okay.
them away.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. Awesome. Great. Well, thank you very much, Houston.